I'm David Liggett with Data Center Hawk, and I am very excited to be joined by Joshua Au. Joshua is in the APAC data center region, an expert there, and so we're really excited to get to dive into what's a really exciting part of the data center industry right now. So Joshua, great to see you.
Glad to be here, and thanks for having me.
Before we start diving into some of the topics that we have we've talked about previously and are going to jump in, talk to us about your background. How did you get plugged into the data center space, and what about it is so intriguing?
Well, suffice to say that most of my peers, when I talk to them, not a single person tells me that, bro, I wanted to join this industry. It has never happened because for reasons that are, I guess, really not clear to me. No one ever thinks about joining a data center, not in my part of the world. So more often than not, it's they are in an ancillary business. It could be in sales, it could be in procurement, it could be in IT, but somehow they manage to stumble into the business. And I think more often than not, at least for the older generations, it was because they were in the telecoms. So I used to support several telecoms providers, which meant that we had IT equipment, but they were put in the telco exchanges. So that was my first exposure to data centers. And slowly but surely, when we talk about implementing systems, we have to go to server rooms. We have to understand what are raised floors, what are racks and cabinets. So that was my exposure. And at some point, after being a Sun Solaris administrator for several years, based out of places like Jakarta, Manila, even China for a short while, I asked myself, how many system administrators do we actually need? There are hundreds and thousands of us. But if you talk about those who are familiar with on-site implementation, it's only a handful. So I think be it point of view, and even I think at that point, I thought to myself, it's actually quite interesting to understand how all of it comes together. So there's a level of curiosity because you can understand IT systems, but without understanding how the physical, the MEP works, you don't quite understand how the whole thing comes together. So curiosity kind of forced me into this line of business.
You bring up a really interesting point about people joining the industry, and I am encouraged that our sector has done a better job of, I would say, maybe making more noise in different parts of the world related to being able to join our industry in different places. You know, whether it's from the facilities side of things, whether it's from specifically like construction, from the real estate portion, from the technology side. And it's really important for our business and our industry to continue because if we don't continue to add talented people, years from now we'll be in a rough spot. So it is always interesting to hear how people got plugged into the data center industry. So I want to spend some time talking about the APAC data center market. One of the things that's consistently asked to me is, hey, what are the next up and coming markets across the world, or in the US or in Europe or in APAC? And so I want to talk about some of those markets, but before we do that, let's talk about some of the trends that you're seeing play out right now in that part of the world.
All right. You might not like what I'm going to say next. But it's a point of, and I say this because I used to be an IT systems integrator, and we spoke about facts to our customers, and it was only much later that I realized that facts are not as important as sentiment. Sentiment drives business. Sentiment drives business decisions. So what I'm saying is perception sometimes trumps reality. If you read the market reports, I think 10 years ago, we talked about that 5 or 6 mature markets in Asia, the likes of Sydney, for example, Sydney, Tokyo, Singapore, Hong Kong, Shanghai. These were mature. We believed in the idea of the epicenter. And in recent years, when Digital talks about center of gravity, it was a data gravity. And I fully agree with the rationale. When certain things come together, it creates that attractiveness that brings in the other businesses. The lawyers will come, the logistics will come, the consultants will come, the surveyors will come. Slowly but surely, it creates that gravity. And we see that with the OTTs, we see that with the cable landing stations. I know I'm simplifying things, but where I'm coming at is, in the past season, we believed in it, and we were looking for hubs. We talked about hubs. And I think in recent years, or at least in the past 2 years plus, I'm seeing, instead of talking about a hub, we're talking about diversifying. We're talking about sharing the pie with the broader community. I have friends who were based out of Singapore. They believe in the hub. And in recent months, some of them have traveled to India and they said to me, bro, I believe the next wave is in India. And I said, well, that's a point of view. Is it true? Is it not? I leave it to imagination. But I agree with the sentiment that it's no longer the era of the hub where one market dominates 20 markets. That's no longer the case, at least for APAC. So we're seeing the eggs being spread more evenly, and interest in places that weren't part of the conversation at least 7, 8 years ago. I hear news about Batam in Indonesia. That's very exciting. I hear news about, for example, Vietnam. I have a friend who's been traveling on a regular basis to Cambodia. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Again, I reserve my comments. But what I'm alluding to is we see more operators spreading out their eggs. And it's kind of like, you remember 15 years ago when we started talking about Africa and we said, nah, it won't happen. It might happen. Connectivity sucks. There was a sentiment. But when the sentiment changed, investors and operators said, yeah, let's take a look. And we see from hindsight, only from hindsight, that those who were the first movers, they had competitive advantage because they had the chance to understand the landscape. They had a chance to realize how to, I think, get things sorted out locally. So I think the era of the hub is, to me, is no more. It's more a case of mini hubs. It's a case of different markets serving their domestic markets. And I guess that international market where we used to talk about one place, that conversation is kind of changing. I know we can take reference to telegeography. Telegeography tells me that Singapore is the most interconnected city in Asia. That's based on international throughput. I fully agree with the narrative. Do we see growth? Yes. Do we see immediate growth? The devil's in the details. And yet we are hearing about New Zealand. New Zealand is very exciting. We have friends there because there's hydropower, because there are subsea cables landing in New Zealand. We hear about Philippines. Philippines is very exciting because there are new cables landing in the Philippines. And I think one thing that isn't said too much about is the marriage between the subsea business and the data center business, because it's kind of like a supply chain. The data is a supply chain, but where does it come from? It comes from the international subsea cables landing at the cable landing stations. And from the cable landing stations, you have your terrestrial fiber, which then lands in certain data centers. I've heard of operators that deep dive and talk about creating a loop instead of a line. I'm referring to particular geography. I won't tell you which particular country, but I know the operator. And I agree with the narrative, because when you plan for a loop from the cable landing station, it means you're building a series of data centers which can work together, and then it creates very interesting magic in terms of DR. So to kind of land the plane, I would say that the devil's in the details. What used to be true may not necessarily be true now. And I also see some interesting conversations, which I'm not sure how they're going to land. I'm not quite sure. We hear about liquid immersion cooling, but EPA said some things last year which ruffled some feathers. And with 3M saying they're going to exit the market, that's going to mess up some people. How does that work out? Again, we don't know. We're simply guessing.
And let me go back to, I want to go back to the comment you made around the hubs and kind of the demand spreading out, I guess. Because I think we see that, not just in APAC, but it's really a global trend that is being created for a lot of different reasons. One, I think, is because it's become much more challenging in different places to really develop data centers. It's really, whether that's, land procurement, whether that's getting the power to be able to come to the land, whether, to your comment about having the correct amount of connectivity. I mean, all of those things those are infrastructure challenges. Lay on the regulatory challenges, moratoriums that take place. And so you have different companies that are looking to invest, and they go, and I mean this from like a data center user standpoint, if they're thinking about their infrastructure, or a data center operator going, hey, do we want to build in this market where things seem really hard? Or do we want to be, one of the things you mentioned was like a first mover in some of these other places that, 5 years from now, we can really have an advantage over other groups. In the US, I would say some of those markets are like Portland, Columbus. These are some secondary markets. Portland has grown significantly because of some larger companies that have taken, pretty big footprints there. But Columbus is, I would say, kind of emerging close behind that. If you kind of picked in your head, hey, where are the, you mentioned Singapore, Hong Kong, Tokyo, kind of, let's put aside the big areas, specifically from your standpoint, what are some of those, you mentioned Vietnam, maybe that's one at the top of the list, but what are some other places that you would go, these are the places to watch?
If purely out of interest, now I say this as an observer. I don't belong to an operator, but looking back, I think Vietnam's interesting for various reasons. AWS has said they've had the local zones. Other OTTs have said, I'm interested in Vietnam. But the elephant in the room is the connectivity. The international connectivity fails easily within 6 to 10 weeks a year. That sucks. And what does it allude to? Simply that in order for them to play, I think, the enterprise game, they have to improve international connectivity. And that leads to the next big question: who's going to invest in the subsea cables to Vietnam? The devil's in the details. I won't answer that. Batam's very interesting because it's at a strategic location. It's close enough, I think, to Australia, to the Indonesian hinterland, to Singapore, Malaysia. So it's in a strategic location. It has built a hub of sorts, and the infrastructure will come. I believe it will come. But I think what's difficult about it is from the outside looking in, and this is something, I mean, we have lots of friends from US, from Europe, and other places. When they come to Singapore, we meet up, we banter. And one particular sentiment, and that's why I say sentiment trumps reality, is that in US, it seems to be a pretty consistent geography. That means that even though different states may compete, but they compete using the same terms or references, by and large, the rules are pretty consistent. The compliance is pretty consistent across the board. For example, if you talk about NFPA, NFPA applies whether in Texas or in another state, it applies. If you go to Europe and you talk about EUDCA, you talk about EN 506, these are commonly accepted terms of references. But when you come to Asia, you realize that each country is a fiefdom. And I mean fiefdom in the sense that it has its own rules, it has its own unspoken players, spoken and unspoken. And that means that when you move from one country to another country, there's no common point of reference. You can move from Malaysia to Singapore and you realize different rules. You go from Indonesia to Philippines, different rules, which means you have to know each market intimately well. These are all, in a sense, disparate.
Yeah, and I think in our market where the last 3 years has all been about scale. How quickly can we scale? How we've got to grow. You take that mentality and put it into some of these, APAC markets, and it gets very challenging. To your point, where you really do have to know not only the macro region really well, but also the micro markets. You got to know those markets inside and out. And to your point, how the infrastructure is put together. What, like from your standpoint, what do some of the power procurement strategies look like, or just being able to acquire land in some of these markets? I mean, what does that look like in APAC, and as compared to Europe or the US?
Well, that's a very tough call. And I'll say this as a layman observer. I suppose in some markets like Singapore, the rules are very clear. You know which agency to talk to. The rules are published, so it's a lot easier. You can talk to brokers. I suppose once you move to places like Japan, Korea, where you may not speak the same language, your dependence on the brokers are a lot, I would say, higher. Sometimes you go to places like, for example, Indonesia, where you need to follow rules like GR71 or JECA. These are not all of it is published in English. The English translations are not exactly very accurate. And what does it mean? You need a translator. You need someone who understands the local rules. Okay, I know I'm kind of skirting the issue, but what I'm alluding to is you have players like NTT. NTT has offices in very obscure places, even in Indochina, years before the market has been opened up. And what does it suggest to you? That NTT is playing the long game. They put some persons there. You don't have assets, but you're there to kind of figure out what's happening, so that when the market opens up, you kind of know where to start. And then you have a lot of new startups, and some of these are friends, that set up shop within the last 12 months, 18 months. And what's their strategy? They are very coy about it. So how are they going into places like the Philippines and Indonesia? Because if we don't know your strategy, we don't really know how you're positioning yourself. But I would then suggest that the devil's in the details. Every market is unique. Every player has a different game, and certain players have regional aspirations. Like you talk to BDX, you talk to PDG, and they often talk about a pan-Asian strategy. But they are not the only players that spans Asia. The likes of NTT, Digital Realty, they have it as well. But seeing it as a spoken and a written strategy means that it's part of your game. And because it's part of the game, your acquisitions are very different, because your plan is to have all the sites between India and China, and you can pitch this to the OTTs that want to have similar presence, but you can offer, I would say, a consistent contract across the board.
Yeah, sure.
That's something that not many can do so. And I guess some are privileged because they have the advantage of the right subsea cables. So that's why the marriage between the subsea cables, the cable landing stations, and the data center, not many can tap on that advantage.
Yeah, that makes sense. From a leasing standpoint, how have you seen maybe the ebbs and flows, not just of like demand, but maybe the trends around? Do you see large leases taking place in some of these markets? Are they smaller in nature? And maybe not leases, but just footprints of different companies. How do most companies like to enter some of these markets?
Well, let's talk about Indonesia, for example. There are certain tracts of land where you see a concentration of data centers. And I guess that happens sometimes by accident, but more often than not, it was strategic. That means that something, the equivalent of an IX within a metro, allows for other operators that are interested to buy tracts of land around it to tap on that connectivity. Because that was the argument with Singapore. You want to go to certain tracts of land because it's near AWS, it could be near Meta, it could be near Google, and that creates the multiplier effect. You know that terrestrial fiber is going to be very rich. You know that in terms of geography, you kind of figure out that, if, for example, Google has a tract of land, it's likely not a land that has grounding issues or that has, for example, flooding. And I've seen a particular player that said, bro, we want to buy this. And I said, it's a bad idea. And they went ahead. And true enough, some months later, they realized that it was flood prone. And when it's flood prone, it's a bummer. I leave it to imagination what I'm alluding to. And earlier, you asked the question about power procurement. And I think power procurement would then make it very evident that not every country is created equally. Not every tract of land is created equally, because there's geography, there is physical geography, there's social geography. There is the issue of roads, there's the issue of power stations, availability of water, and then the fine details of whether that particular piece of land is it going to be difficult to build, because you need to have level ground. So in places like Hong Kong, they may give you a piece of land, but that if you have to dig through rock, that makes it a little more difficult. Your capital cost will be much higher.
Your commentary around capital going into not only the acquisitions of site, but the site prep today, especially as you get into maybe, I would say, second tier markets or markets traditionally that haven't seen as much data center demand as some of these larger areas have. It's becoming a much bigger part of the discussion. When I, previous to doing Data Center Hawk, I worked for a brokerage company, and we would always say, the land acquisition cost is a rounding error when you look at the total amount of investment made in a data center facility. And at the end of the day, there's obviously a lot more money coming into the facility and hardware and even software over a 20-year period than there is on the acquisition cost. But they've gone up significantly, across the board, which is a really good point. Okay, I want to end with this. Tell me, when you think about the next 3 to 5 years, tell me why you get excited about being part of the data center industry.
Okay, this will sound a little cheesy, and I've said it in another forum. Why do we do what we do? There must be an easier way to make money. I'm pretty sure there is. And I would sum it up that if you've been doing this more than 10 years, you must have a love for the craft. You love the craft. And I know that by craft, it means different things to different people. To you, it could be understanding markets. For me, it could be operations. And to some, it's about design and build. But we love the craft. We love what we do. We love the people. We love to serve. And if we didn't love people and loving to serve these people, again, there must be a better way to make money. And I think increasingly it is evident that we are all very passionate, well, not in equal terms, but we're all passionate about the planet and sustainability. So all the things we do are led by first principles. When I used to run a site, I would tell my staff and my contractors and partners that it's about having a place that is safe, secure, reliable. Outside of these confounds and looking inward, it's about loving the craft, loving the people, loving the planet. And when you're driven by first principles, it's understandable why so many of us are into the advocacy, we're into the research and development, and we see different permutations of friends coming together to talk, be it like in iMasons when it came out with the iMasons Climate Accord, when friends in Europe, they had the Climate Neutral Data Center Pact, for example, and even friends from the Green Grid bringing friends together to have certain interesting conversations. And yes, BITSI is very active in my part of the world. They have a conference, I think, in a few days' time. I believe it's in a few days' time.
Thank you so much for joining us. We're, I think as we continue to look at areas that are growing, I feel like in the middle of the radar is the APAC region, and you're right in the middle of that. And so we just want to thank you for your insight, and we look forward to having you on again in the future.
I look forward to it.